Crushed by Richard L. Elsliger. When Hegan accepted the job, he was advised that he might encounter occasional disturbances in the back, but in time he would grow to accept them as a minor annoyance to his employment. The gasoline station came out of the 1950s, an antiquated structure that served not only fuel, but also at one time serviced cars in need of repair. Hegan asked for details about such claimed disturbances, but the employer remained exceedingly vague. The vagaries of his employer's answers gave Hegan pause, thinking disturbances to be unwritten code for robberies, retail theft, and possible shootings. A cursory investigation of the area indicated that the neighborhood was above par, unfettered by the deluge of high crime rates that infested other towns beyond the periphery of this otherwise sleepy community. He cudgeled his brain to decipher the cryptic words of his employer, unable to find any satisfactory answers. The specter that the place might be haunted hadn't even entered his mind. Hegan heard the disturbance of which the employer referenced, but not until a full week into his shift while working the front counter of the gas station store. It happened on a late Saturday night, the disturbance materializing in the form of a tumultuous crash, followed by a scream emanating from the back room. The sound shocked Hegan out of his stool, and he stood at attention. The last customer had come and gone a good half hour ago, and the perimeter of the station was dead, save for the occasional car driving along Main Street. Hegan checked his watch. The time read 11:29 p.m., near quitting time. Hegan removed the flashlight from under the counter and left the bulletproof terrarium, as he lovingly called his workplace. He walked to the back, searching for the source of this crash and primordial howl. Earlier in the week, Hegan had tried to enter the back room as part of an exploratory expedition to familiarize himself with all areas and aspects of the station. But the door handle to the back room, an austere and imposing brass knob from the 1950s, refused to give in to Hegan's insistent attempts to gain entry on his first day of employment. Now, the immediacy of the crash and scream demanded access to what lay beyond the door. He tried the handle again, but it refused to open, so he knocked on the door with 3 firm raps. The door gave way, creaking ajar on rusted hinges. Hegan pushed on the door with insistence, exposing a darkened void. "Hello?" he said, flashing the light deep into a wall of blackness, scanning the hidden recesses and obscure corners, anywhere someone or something might hide. A delayed and faint echo of his voice came back to him, the hesitancy of its return flying contrary to his expectations. He entered past the threshold and fumbled for a light switch. He'd been given specific instructions to avoid the back room, that it was locked for a reason, the pretext being that it housed old automotive equipment and 2 hydraulic lifts that were off limits. Hegan found the light switch and flipped it, but nothing worked. He shined the flashlight deeper into the void and saw that it had been a garage at one time. Old diagnostic equipment littered the area, machines built by defunct manufacturers parading their obsolescence around the shop, covered in thick layers of dust. From the periphery of his eye, Hegan thought he saw motion, a shadow that loomed over a diagnostic machine and then was gone. He quickly trained the flashlight at a powder blue Sun engine performance tester, looking for movement. The light penetrated the displays, illuminating red needles and dials that once diagnosed engine troubles on old carbureted vehicles from a bygone era. He walked over to the massive machine and examined its functions, a complex array of switches and analog readouts that gave him pause to imagine the bustle of this garage in its heyday. He pointed the flashlight at 2 hoists. One of the hoists sat in its floor cradle, looking neglected and disused for decades. The other saddle bolstered an old 1968 Camaro. The Camaro sat up high above the floor, buried in dust, frozen in time. An oil catch basin was positioned beneath the oil pan, ready to collect a stream of chocolatey used oil that never flowed. Hegan noted a box wrench stuck to the drain plug, fused there from decades before, as if the last person to work on the car had stopped midway, never to return and complete the job. Hegan heard the front door chime and turned toward the light of the store, leaving behind the back room to go deal with a customer. He felt for the lock on the door but found none. He shined the light on the knob and it appeared smooth with no apparent lock or catch. He closed the door and met the customer from the safety of his bulletproof glass. "Yes, I'll take $50 on pump 3 and a scratch-off ticket." The woman handed Hegan a $50 bill plus a 5, and he slid a random ticket to her under the glass. "You're good to go," he said, activating the pump. She left, and Hegan resumed his high stool within the terrarium, thinking about the back room while watching the customer pump her gas, then drive away. As best he could reckon, a significant remodeling must have occurred to this station, a revamping that resulted in the construction of a solid outside wall toward the back, replacing what likely were bay doors. The fact that the station had a garage off to the side belied its tiny outward appearance, Hegan mused. He could not understand the secrecy behind this hidden vault in the back, but planned to get more information on the station's history. Noting a lull in customers, he again went to the back room, but the door was locked. Hegan checked the time, 12 midnight. He swiftly killed the lights and closed the station. Driving home, many questions swirled inside his head. Hegan woke late Sunday morning with a nosebleed. The blood streamed into his mouth like a waterfall, and he reached for a tissue to abate its flow. He'd not had a nosebleed for years, so why now? His head throbbed with pain, producing the worst headache he could ever remember. Something weird was afoot, and he needed answers. Hegan got up and ate breakfast while researching the history of his workplace using every source he could find. Very few articles on the old station were accessible, though he did learn that at one time the station belonged to Standard Oil. Then Standard Oil became subsumed by Amoco, which became subsumed by BP. The evidence suggested that the service center garage abruptly ceased its activities in the late 1970s for reasons unstated. The next workday, Monday, Hegan determined would involve another search into the back room, and if any more of these so-called disturbances made their presence known, he would be prepared for a fight. He spent Sunday in relative leisure, riding the bike path and lifting weights at the local health club. Monday afternoon arrived exceedingly fast, and Hegan found himself at the counter again, ensconced inside his bulletproof terrarium, transacting business with the general public and thinking about the anomaly in the back. He attempted to gain access to the back room at the beginning of his shift, but the door remained locked as before. He resented himself for not placing a wedge in the door when he had the opportunity. Numerous customers came and went during his shift until Hegan checked his watch and realized he would soon need to close. He tidied shelves and did money counts from the till, making special note. He looked out the window for stragglers, and seeing none, he squatted on his stool, letting the remaining time wind off the clock before closing. He heard a noise again, this time a steady, methodical clang from the back room, what sounded like a hydraulic lift in elevation mode, a unique sound based on its own special characteristics, and a sound Hegan knew well, having worked in an automotive repair shop in his past. He stood up from his stool, grabbed the flashlight, and walked toward the room, his hands icy cold. He tried the door handle, but as before, it remained steadfastly locked. From behind the door, he heard the pounding of metal on metal contact. Then he heard a vicious crash, followed by a petrifying shriek. He instinctively seized upon the door, and the handle released. He kicked the door open to darkness. He tried again for the light switch, forgetting that the overhead lights were inoperable, and then switched on his flashlight. He passed through the back room door, pointing the light everywhere. "Hello? Hello?" he exclaimed. His voice reverberated off of the walls with a hollow and haunting return. He aimed the flashlight at the diagnostic equipment and saw the needles briefly fluctuate before falling to their resting positions. "That's impossible," he said. Hegan walked to the big machines for a closer look. The needles remained settled in their resting positions when he lit them up. He aimed the flashlight around the garage, looking for movement. He thought he heard the faintest of voices, a tormented mumble of unintelligible words that came from everywhere, making it impossible for him to localize the source. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Hegan pointed the flashlight at the hydraulic hoists and drew closer to the Camaro, still on its perch. He inspected the lift and the floor beneath it. He smelled the acrid odor of fresh hydraulic fluid and aimed the light back at the floor, noticing a reddish-brown pool. An inexplicable chill ran up his spine. He pointed the light in the direction of some dusty tools on a workbench and went over to investigate. He picked up a screwdriver and walked to the exit, but before leaving, he jammed the screwdriver into the floor where the door met the frame, preventing the door from fully closing. The next day, Hegan showed up early for his shift, intending to intercept the manager who showed up Tuesdays to check on the condition of the store. Hegan parked his car in his usual spot and saw Fred behind the counter talking to the first shift worker. Hegan paced to the front door and caught Fred just as he was about to leave. "Hey Fred, I need to ask you a couple of questions." Fred's eyes widened. "Questions?" Fred asked. "Go ahead, feel free, Hegan, but I don't have a lot of time." "Fred, did anything unusual happen in the back? I mean the back room? I've been hearing strange noises there and someone screaming late at night. Is there anything you want to tell me?" "Nothing really," he said. "It used to be a service garage, that's all I know. They shut it down in the late 1970s, which of course is way before my involvement. That's about all I can tell you." Fred wiped away a spot of perspiration from his forehead. "Okay, but didn't your uncle own the station around that time? Did he tell you anything?" "Well, not that I know of. I mean, what are you getting at, Hegan? You think the back room is haunted?" Hegan laughed at the notion. "No, I suppose not, but there are some unusual sounds coming from the back." "Well, I did warn you that the job came with some unusual disturbances. I mean, I did tell you that at the beginning when you accepted the job, remember?" "You did," said Hegan. "I'm just asking some questions. If something weird happened back there, it might explain a lot." "Well, regrettably, I have no more answers to give on the subject, and I have a meeting to attend. The head office is rounding us up to discuss what we're going to do about these ridiculous gas prices. We might have a public mutiny on our hands if prices get any higher." "Yes, fair enough," said Hegan. "I'll see you around, Fred." With that, Fred left in a frenzy, and Hegan relieved the first shift cashier. Hegan watched the first shift worker drive away before heading to check on the back room. When the worker was out of range, Hegan made his way to the rear of the store, outside of camera view, and checked to see if his screwdriver was still in place. He gave a quick visual inside the garage and did a practice kick on the door, to which it swung open on its creaking hinges. Satisfied, Hegan closed the door and returned to his post. The customers came in sporadically through the late afternoon, somewhat deterred by the obscene gas prices. The paucity of customers today gave Hegan an opportunity to psychologically plan for another garage encounter this evening. His additional research on this gas station, delving into old archives for newspaper articles, revealed nothing. He watched the setting sun from the plate glass window, and before long, nightfall set in. Around 11 o'clock p.m., Hegan heard a commotion in the back. The faintest sound of hammers and impact wrenches reached him in taunting ways. He rose up and rushed to the back room door, kicking it open. Inside, he saw bright lights and the outlines of cars scattered throughout the garage, both hoists in use, the Camaro in its usual place, and a Pontiac GTO resting on the other. The cars, all of them, looked old. He saw a 60s Shelby Mustang with gold stripes off in a corner, and a black 70s Chevelle poised right next to it. A red Plymouth Roadrunner nearby was toiled over by a number of workers. He saw them busily removing body parts from the Roadrunner, plying away fenders and doors. Hegan watched with fascination at the spectacle that played before him. One man worked frantically beneath the Camaro, removing suspension parts. Still other men were disassembling car interiors on the Chevelle and the Mustang. The men worked at a chaotic pace, oblivious to Hegan's presence. The man under the Camaro strained to remove the tie rods, fixated on the end goal, when the hoist without warning lost its hydraulics and came crashing down on the man, pinning him underneath the Camaro, crushing his ribs, asphyxiating him on the spot. It did not take him long to die. Blood came spewing from the mouth, and his arms flailed beneath the tonnage that rested on his chest. All of the workers stopped and rushed to the victim, looking down at him with wide eyes. Hegan watched from the entrance, paralyzed with fear, unable to advance or retreat. He watched the crushed man stare at him, as if to convey a message, but then the life vanished from his eyes, while a river of blood streamed forth and coagulated around his body. The workers faded away like ghostly specters, and the lights went out, leaving Hegan in a pool of darkness, save for the light coming from the store. He shut the door in terror, leaving behind this sick and twisted illusion. He kicked something along the floor when he retreated and saw the screwdriver at his feet. He must have kicked it out from the floor when he turned away. Hegan grabbed the door handle, but it was once again locked. He determined that he would tell no one what he'd witnessed tonight. To speak of what he saw might cost him his job, and he actually enjoyed working at the gas station aside from this surreal and haunting diversion. He checked his watch. In half an hour, he locked up the store and went home, but this time he had an idea. Hegan woke up early the next morning and drove to a nearby neighborhood north of the gas station. He canvassed a few houses, knocking on doors to ask questions about what they knew about the history of his workplace. No one could provide a satisfactory answer until Hegan reached the bottom of the street. There stood a lonely old house overgrown with vines and overrun with unkempt grass. Hegan knocked on the door with 3 firm raps. A tired old man came to the door, someone who gave the impression that he'd been a fixture in the area from the start. "Hello, sir. My name is Hegan. I work at the gas station down the street. Is it okay if I ask you a few questions about that station? I'm hoping you can give me answers." The old man hesitated, evaluating Hegan's facial features, making an assessment of his trustworthiness. "Well, okay. Come on in then, just for a few minutes," he said. He held the door open and Hegan stepped back in time. The house contained old photos and mementos on display from eras long past. The furniture dated back to the 1960s and complemented the antiquated shag carpeting. A faint odor of advanced age hung thickly throughout the house, a stale pall of gloom. Hegan brushed aside the anachronisms and oddities, focusing instead upon his objective, to get the answers he needed. "You can call me Alex," said the old guy. "I've lived here all my life, so I can tell you everything about the area. Just about. What would you like to know?" Hegan cleared his throat. "Well, sir, as I stated, I work at the gas station down the street. I was curious about its history. What can you tell me?" The old man paused and folded his arms. He began to recall the history, the initial construction, the buyouts, and ending with an unexpected but treacherous story of infamy behind that garage. He told the story in graphic detail, the transactions that went on there at night. The gas station began as an honest enterprise and became tainted when it got sold off by the original family. The next owner was a thief, one of the best car thieves known in the greater metropolitan area, actually, and his station provided a safe haven for one of the most notorious chop shops of the 1970s, until law enforcement caught on to the scheme and shut them down. Hegan listened with the intensity of a high-tension power line, absorbing every detail. The crescendo of the old man's narration reached its zenith when he told the sordid story of the thief who died there one night, crushed to death by a Camaro that came down on him before the cops could intervene. Bad timing saw to his demise. When the police arrived on scene, he was already dead, and that is when they noticed certain irregularities about the place, glaring clues that suggested car thievery. The cops busted the place the next day with a warrant, and the rest was history. The station was sold to another family member, and the garage was shut down, boarded up and locked away, never to see the light of day ever again. Hegan leaned back in the chair with a fuller understanding. Everything made sense now. Hegan dared not speak to the old man about what he'd witnessed last night. Word always traveled fast, and it wouldn't be long before everyone in the area knew that a lunatic worked at the gas station, and his name was Hegan. "Well, thank you for the history," said Hegan. "Well, you're most welcome," said the old man. He stood up and led Hegan to the entranceway, but before he opened the door, he stopped and turned to look at Hegan directly in the eyes. "I'd be careful working at that station," he said. "I understand the place is haunted, and they lost several employees over the years because of it. It is also rumored that the station was built on an ancient Indian burial ground." The commentary chilled Hegan's very soul. "I'll be careful, sir, don't worry, and thank you for the warning." Hegan left with the heavy knowledge of a death in the back room and a trapped spirit doomed to eternally suffer the wake of that death. More troublesome were the employees that came and went over the years, for it remained unclear why they quit. Fear drove their departures. It had to be fear. Hegan did not fault his predecessors for leaving, yet the confirmation that the back room was the epicenter of a haunting unsettled him and weighed upon his conscience like a cold early morning fog. He started his second shift that day with a plan that he would photograph the scene when it manifested. He would then have proof of the haunting and could get an expert ghost hunter involved. The afternoon wore on, tedious yet busy despite the high gas prices. He had an argument with one customer who insisted that he scratch the lottery ticket on her behalf. Hegan politely refused, explaining that state law prohibited him from scratching the ticket for any buyer. They parried back and forth for a minute, but Hegan stood his ground, and the customer walked off in a huff, threatening never to come back. The early evening was less dramatic, and Hegan braced for more paranormal activity from the garage. He retreated to the rear of the store to try out the door, but it remained locked. He cursed himself for kicking out that damn screwdriver. Late evening came, and the customers tapered off to a trickle, and then there were none. An eerie silence cast an invisible cloak over the store, and Hegan sat on his stool, hyper-focused on every sound. The dull hum of the coolers, normally an imperceptible ambient vibration, was magnified to a very noticeable level of great intensity. The crackling sounds of potato chip bags, popcorn, and candy bars intensified like static electricity as Hegan reorganized them into their respective places. Everything in the store brought Hegan to a heightened state of awareness. He waited for the sound of the hydraulic lift, and almost on cue it began to clang like a doomsday bell, projecting its deathly presence throughout the station. Hegan went to the rear door and tried the handle again, but it remained locked. Hegan waited by the door for the anticipated crash, followed by a scream. It was due any minute now. The crash came as expected right at 11:29 p.m., with a horrendous shriek trailing in its wake. When the scream ended, Hegan twisted the knob, kicking open the door just as the lights went out. He turned on the flashlight and aimed the solitary beam toward the interior, more determined this time to ascertain how to deal with the paranormal, a subject that eluded him on so many levels. The garage was devoid of activity, its haunting workers gone, but the Camaro, still there, maintained a formidable presence high upon the hoist. Hegan stepped beyond the threshold and drew nearer to the Camaro, curious about its haunting existence and lured by the faded chrome Cragars that hadn't turned in decades. Hegan took a few steps closer. He heard the faintest voice from behind the Camaro, beckoning him on. The voice seemed to ask for help in the most subtle of ways. The voice told Hegan to loosen the drain plug from the oil pan, an unfinished job decades old that needed completion or the spirit would never rest. Hegan saw the invitation as his chance to do good, to release the spirit from this world to find everlasting peace. He complied, positioning himself under the engine. He shined a light on the oil pan and reached for the box wrench that had fused itself with the drain plug decades ago. The voice suggested that if he could get the drain plug off, that not only would the spirit be free, but that Hegan could keep the car as his reward. Hegan took hold of the wrench and started on the plug. Just at the instant he applied some pressure, the deafening sound of a hydraulic hiss filled the garage, and the Camaro came crashing down with crushing force. Hegan lay flattened beneath the Camaro, blood coming from his nose, mouth, and ears. As he lay dying, the garage lit up with the most intense bright light he'd ever seen. Men and women materialized from the deep corners and recesses, gathering around him, watching his last breaths exit his body in short and laborious increments. Hegan could see faint blue outlines over the watchers, their paranormal energy evident. He saw the original thief stand over him, acting within his capacity as the ringleader, the demonic boss of these poor unfortunate souls, the souls of former gas station attendants, legions of them collected over the years, now standing behind the boss, all of them trapped within the confines of the back room, minions forever doomed to work in the chop shop, hacking on cars but never finishing, always seeking new help to alleviate their eternal burdens. Hegan's eyes closed from one moment to the next. When he reopened his eyes, he saw the Camaro unmoved from its original position, still on the hoist, still high up in the air, still covered in dust. His pain was gone, and he collected the flashlight from the floor. He stood up and brushed off the dirt from his clothing and headed for the door. He grabbed the doorknob and twisted, but it was locked. He tried again with greater insistence, but the handle would not yield to his grasp. The others gathered around him and handed over tools to strip cars, welcoming Hegan to his new realm, an eternal night where he would forever strip cars of their parts, never completing the task, working the backroom chop shop with his new co-workers for all eternity.